Welcome to another episode of Progress and Promise.
Thank you for joining us.
You'd have to be living under a pretty big rock to not have noticed. There's a lot going on in our community these days, from construction downtown to the expansion of the already massive Navy Federal Complex in Beulah. There are plenty of reasons to see good things ahead for this community.
Absolutely, and we're taking a look at some of those good things, and we'd like to share with you what we found. Enormous seagoing vessels like this one are often docked at the Port of Pensacola. The so-called flotel, or hotel on the water, is a supply ship that takes on big projects related to oil and gas industry work. That industry is growing in the Gulf, and Pensacola is in a prime location to take advantage of it.
The deep water drilling is going more towards the central Gulf, and Pensacola just kind of lines up with that. But people don't realize how easy Pensacola is to get in and out of. When you compare it to Mobile, it's like a 1 to 2 hour trip to get into Pensacola, where it's a 4 to 6 hour trip to get into facilities in Mobile. So, you know, that was one of the selling points.
Buddy McCormick is vice president of Offshore Inland, a company that provides maintenance and engineering services to ships working offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. They signed a 15-year lease with the port in 2010, expecting to invest millions at the facility. The company provides around 100 good-paying jobs related to shipyard work.
We have some guys who actually ride their bikes to work, and they can make $20, $25 an hour. I mean, we're blue collar, get your hands dirty, but get paid well. When the ships are in, we work a lot of overtime, and we have great benefits, and we're a diverse company. Almost 40% of our workforce are minorities.
Offshore Inland is now in the process of negotiating a 30-year lease for another warehouse. If that goes through, along with a related project, the port could see at least 200 more jobs and millions more investment dollars. A busy port isn't only good for Offshore Inland. The crews who live and work aboard these vessels have time and money to spend when they're here.
But they're making $20 and $25 an hour, not $8 and $10 an hour, so they've got money to spend. And they're typically young, they're blue collar, and they like to go to restaurants and have fun. So I think they love Pensacola. They love the entertainment district. I mean, once I get a vessel to come here and they see the quality of life we have, the clean environment, it's not hard to get them to come back.
Downtown is another bright spot for Pensacola. It has become a popular shopping and entertainment district thanks to a lot of new business growth, including the Maritime Park. Patrick Elabash of Elabash Jewelry Company on Palafox is excited about the growth. He's the 4th generation of his family to work in the namesake jewelry store.
The biggest difference, I think, is the traffic every single day of the week now. I mean, we used to have slower days, like Saturdays used to be a quieter day for us, and that's no longer the case. Saturday is one of our best days, and I think that's a change for the positive of downtown.
Patrick has worked at the downtown business for 9 years and watched many of those changes unfold.
I would say the occupancy of all the storefronts. I mean, you used to see a lot of empty buildings. You don't see a whole lot of that anymore. You see a lot of construction, people renovating and so forth, but downtown's pretty full.
Full, with not only new businesses and plenty of locals to patronize them, but tourists as well.
Well, you have a whole lot of stuff in a small area. Everything from the historic district to AA baseball to fantastic local restaurants, all in one little small area.
Pensacola's historic district is another draw with potential to capitalize on cultural heritage tourism, a burgeoning industry. With 450 years of history and culture to share, places like Pensacola's historic village are an even bigger draw to tourists who are particularly interested in the past. The UWF Historic Trust manages 29 historic sites in the two-county area. In fact, 2 UWF professors developed an app that will not only raise the area's profile in cultural heritage tourism, but also allow users to download sites targeted to their specific interests. Not far from the historic district is the Pensacola Mess Hall, a hands-on science museum. Director Megan Pratt developed it out of her own love of science. She hopes these messy demonstrations and projects will help children enrich their education and develop their own appreciation for science. After more than 2.5 years, the Mess Hall is becoming a destination stop for locals and visitors.
Sometimes they'll come in because big sister's at ballet or children's chorus and they want to have something to do with the little kids during the class. But they come in and are exploring, and we also have a lot of tourists. It's about 35% of our visitor groups have at least someone from out of town.
While much of downtown has been geared for adults, Pratt says a family-friendly place like the Mess Hall helps round out what Pensacola has to offer.
You know, it's a great thing for particularly the older kids who aren't necessarily finding things to do. We get calls all the time from people, well, what else would be good for a 10-year-old on a vacation here or something like that? And there's a limited options. And it's also part of making this a more technology-oriented community to encourage people to think about science careers.
From science projects to port projects, downtown Pensacola is a great example of how our area can make the most of our strengths. Buddy McCormick says there's no reason their niche market with the oil and gas industry shouldn't continue to grow.
Well, I think as long as we do our job and keep the customers happy and get the vessels out on time, that this market will grow. It's got all that attributes lined up to be a real positive thing for our industry.
Promising signs that could prove to be the next chapter in our success story.
Isn't it great to celebrate the good things about Pensacola? Celebrating wins in Pensacola, the ones that they've earned recently, is especially important in light of some of the hurdles that we still see ahead for our community as well.
Absolutely, Molly, and that is why I think the work we are doing with the Studer Institute is so important, because a lot of the conversation is focused on the negative, but not in a constructive way. And what we want to do with our first publication, which should be coming to you imminently,
absolutely,
is set the table so that folks have a way to talk about the challenges and the successes, but in a data-driven, very nonpartisan, fact-based way.
Absolutely. So in a nutshell, what the Studer Institute is a group of people. We all have the same goal. We want to see this community move in a positive direction. Mm-hmm. And I think over the years, what's been difficult about seeing Pensacola move ahead is getting everybody in the same room to stay focused on the things that we really need to talk about. So it's deciding what do we need to talk about, mm-hmm. getting everybody focused enough on those things to actually discuss them, and make it clear that this isn't about making sure that just one particular viewpoint comes across. You want a clearinghouse for all viewpoints. That's the idea, so that we can move forward. And the only way to do that is using, like you said, fact-based research. That's why we're partnering with UWF's Haas Center to break down some of those statistics for us.
Absolutely. And the beautiful thing about the way that we are set up is that we do not have the daily sort of journalism pressures that other media entities have. We can focus on something for as long as we want to in every different avenue of storytelling that we choose to use. And that's great, especially because we will have this wonderful data that Dr. Rick Harper and his team at the Haas Center are helping put together for us. They are brilliant people, way smarter than you and I.
Absolutely, yes. And breaking down some of what they have to say is really our job, so that the average person, the layman, can understand what they're talking about. And just for an example, you know, this is one of the things that first came up when Shannon, who has been with this for a little bit longer than I certainly have, but it was exciting to join on board because we are on the same page. We do want to see this community improve. And one of the examples that we talked about early on was that 60% of Escambia County students are on free or reduced lunch. So how do you break down those numbers? Those are the kinds of numbers and statistics that the Haas Center is taking a look at, everything from education to crime to the economy, and we're using that data to give people a very real picture of what our community looks like, what we're doing well in, the things that we need improving on, and need to improve, I should say. So working with Rick Harper, that's an invaluable resource because they can give us the information, and then it's what we do with it.
In a way, it's a perfect partnership because, you know, they have all of this research, they have all this data, but they don't have a way to convey it outside the academic world. We are the storytellers, and it's our job to marry the human face with what that data means. And, you know, I think that one of the great things that this opportunity presents is a chance to say, these are the metrics that we have looked at, and we think that if we measure these things over time, not only will we get a real clear idea of what the state of our community is, but also we'll get a good idea of when we're making progress and in what areas we're making progress. I think that's really important for Pensacola. It's something we struggle with. We have studies till the cows come home, but putting those things into action and then following up on them later, we fall down a little bit there, let's be honest.
Absolutely, and I think you bring up a good point. These benchmarks, and we'll talk in a minute a little bit more specifically about what they are and how we're going to identify them. But the important thing about those benchmarks is, like you said, not only measuring our progress, giving ourselves some way to measure how well we're doing in these very important areas, but also, like we mentioned before, to keep the conversation focused on what people need to be talking about. And ideally, we will identify these issues because we've got the data to show this is why they're important. This is why we need to be talking about education. This is why we need to be talking about healthcare, because we're going to show how it relates to the economy, how it relates to your pocketbook, and then hopefully keep the conversation focused on those issues and any issues that impact those issues, if you will, so that our city leaders, our county leaders, our local community leaders can see this is the direction that we need to be focusing on. This is what we need to look at if we really want to see our community move forward, as opposed to getting distracted over who's going to build what where.
Yes, and you have one of the best stories, I think, that we're working on for the publication, and that is looking at what is driving the local economy, what are the sort of the forces for good and the forces for not good, as it were.
Yes.
Talk some about what you discovered in your reporting about that.
Well, you know, it's fascinating because, like you said, you know, coming from an organization where you churn out daily news, you don't always have the time to get in depth into some of these issues that we see every day. If it's a convenience store robbery, why is somebody robbing a convenience store every day? Well, it has to do with drug addiction, but you don't have time to get into some of those issues. You know, if we are having students 60% on free and reduced lunch, why are so many kids in our community doing that? And as I start to look into the forces that drive our economy story, and in fact, all of our stories that are in here are really tied in one way or the other. If you live in this community, you're affected by crime, you're affected by healthcare, you're affected by things that you don't realize it because we all end up paying for it in one way or the other. But yeah, what I thought was interesting was that the forces drive our economy. It's the typical things that you would expect, of course. We still rely heavily on tourism-related jobs. We still rely heavily on, you know, for instance, janitorial type work. There's a lot of opportunities for people who are going to do blue-collar type jobs. But the problem is, because our education is, we get poor marks in that, because we often get poor marks in healthcare, how do we attract those companies that bring in the better paying jobs? Because that's one thing we hear all the time. People want to work, and they want to make good money to raise their families and to take care of their families. So it's like, how do we identify those areas that need improvement so that we can attract those companies into this town and attract them? And we are found some surprising areas that we are growing. Offshore Inland is a good example. Out there at the port of Pensacola, they service the trucks that do the oil industry exploration, or the trucks, I should say, the tankers. That they do use trucks in that, but that's a land-based vehicle. But yes, they service the ships and the tankers that head out there that are working in the oil and gas exploration out in the Gulf. That is a growing industry.
And it's going to be something that grows for the next 10 or 15 years, our experts tell us, because of the expansion of especially natural gas exploration off the Louisiana coast. So we're not going to get the ships that do that, but what we will get, we have learned, will be the business to service those ships so they don't have to go so far back in to get repairs, and that's a niche for us. And because those large manufacturing jobs that were plentiful here 30 or 40 years ago, I mean, they're gone, and they're not going to come back on the scale that they were before. And so I think that we are smart to try to pick the niches that we can focus on. The offshore inland. I know that the ST Aerospace and other sort of related aerospace industries that are looking at locating in the area, that may be another niche for us to grow. Those are jobs that pay well. You know, 32% of the people who live in our area get by on $32,000 a year or less. I don't know that everyone really realizes that, but when you talk about why so many kids are on free and reduced lunch, it's because their parents make $32,000 a year.
People are struggling, and we need these kind of jobs that industries like Offshore Inland and ST Aerospace bring, because these are more blue-collar related jobs, $25 an hour welding jobs. You talk about ST Aerospace, you're talking about aircraft maintenance and repair. And this is the kind of area that is good for them to set up shop in, because we have high military retiree rates. We have guys that are just getting out of the military that have some experience in this. And also we have a workforce that is ready to learn and ready to train.
Absolutely. How many people showed up to the ST Aerospace job fair that they had, several months ago? Twice as many as there are job openings. But and as you said, this touches on the education deficit. Only half of those people met the base minimum requirement for employment with the company, which tells us, I think, that there's some disconnect between the public school system, perhaps the state college system. The workforce education, I think, is an area that we really need to focus on, particularly if we want this to be a place where everyone succeeds together, because I don't think we'll get much farther along economically than we are right now if we don't address that strata of folks that they're hanging on at the edge right now by their fingernails.
One paycheck away from losing everything. And it's a hard thing to watch, and when you want to see your community grow, those are the kinds of things you have to tackle. You have to put people back to work.
Absolutely. And I think one of the other interesting aspects of the report that we're looking into, one of our colleagues, Reggie Dogan.
Yes.
Fabulous writer. He spent several years as a teacher, and he is going to bring both his classroom insight and his insight as a journalist into two critical areas for the future of our community, I think. Reggie is taking a lot of time looking at the high school graduation rate, which is, I think it's safe to say, not very promising.
I know. And it ties into what we were talking about before, the job training for some of these jobs that are coming up. There are some programs, speaking on the bright side of things, that, local colleges are implementing. Pensacola State College has a program, for example, that targets, they have a grant through the Affordable Care Act, where they offer people from low-income households the chance to get the child care that they need. For instance, they have a lot of single mothers. So you take a single mother, for example, who is trying to make ends meet. She doesn't have the money to really afford child daycare, much less the books and the tuition that it would take to go to school.
And transportation.
And the transportation, child care and transportation, two huge issues that keep the people who need the training, who need those jobs, from getting what they need to go ahead and pursue those opportunities. So there are programs in this town right now that they're working to help these people get the training that they need. They're giving them the support that they need financially as well as emotionally, if you will, to be able to make that transition out of a low-income lifestyle where they've never perhaps seen that demonstrated for them before. They've not had a parent go to college. Their parents have barely been hanging on, from paycheck to paycheck. So there's opportunities out there, and it's good in several ways, because you're A, breaking the cycle of poverty, and two, you're giving these people a chance to do what they want to do anyway, get off of perhaps government assistance and be able to provide for their families themselves. But it's something that they can't do without help, and that's, I think, something that's important to focus on. And what I found was interesting about Reggie's article when he was talking about the graduation rate is it hits on some of those same issues. How do we get in there? We can't be the parent for these struggling child, so how do we get in there and either address the problems with the child themselves within the education system, or make their parents more aware of this is what we need to help make a more successful community.
One of the things that I've talked with the superintendent of Escambia County Schools, Malcolm Thomas, before, and he has, when we had these budget cuts that came a couple of years ago, one of the first things that went by the wayside was summer school. Well, when summer school goes away, you have a group of students who are on the bubble, who may have benefited from, that extra semester or 6 weeks worth of education time, so that they wouldn't fall so far behind as 9th graders or 10th graders. Because the graduation rate is so low, it's 64% overall, it's 71% for white students, but it is an appalling 51% for the black students in our school district, that reinstituting summer school for some students is something that the school district is going to look at. That's an unintended consequence of the budget cut to save money for summer school, but what it ended up doing was putting a group of kids even further behind. And so, do you pay for them then, or do you pay for them at the end when they don't graduate from high school? Because you will pay.
Absolutely, and that's what we see. Whether it's somebody who doesn't have a job, they get desperate, they start to turn to drugs because they're depressed about the situation, or they end up getting involved in other things that negatively impact our community, whether it's a crime angle or because their health is so bad that they don't have health insurance, so they end up at the emergency room getting health care. So
which drives up the cost of everything for the rest of us.
Absolutely. So again, if we don't address it, like you said, on the front end, then we're going to be paying for it on the back end. And so what we see as our jobs is to try to bring those issues to the community, show the facts and the relevant information that shows what we're talking about, that backs it up, that explains it, and then also let people know, hey, this is what we can do about it. So we can all work together to focus those conversations on the things that we need to do to tackle and improve. And I think it's nice, we won't be able to run through all of them, but we're trying to set benchmarks, 11 benchmarks to measure our community, and we're choosing, the hard part is actually narrowing it all down.
It was, you know, we talked a lot amongst ourselves. We talked a lot with our colleagues at the Haas Center who are working with us. They did a lot of research on how other demographers and other economists have studied communities to see what kind of measures they used. We sought some feedback from the community as well. You know, when I asked Rick Harper, what's the one thing? What's the magic bullet? What's the one thing we can do that will improve our economic prospects? And he said something I didn't certainly expect him to say, which is to have literate and numerate 4-year-olds eager and ready to learn when they show up for preschool. Which is not something you think the economist is going to tell you, but if you think about it, it's true. About 25% or so of our kindergartners show up to kindergarten behind, some of them as much as 2 years behind. Well, if you follow that through, that's about the same amount of kids who are not graduating from high school. If we could get them at the front end, how much would we save? How much better off would they be, and would we be if we can make it happen at that end, when it's much cheaper to fix the problem then. So that's why kindergarten readiness is one of the 11 measures that we want to look at. We think that's a good measure of how you start out in the education system. I think the graduation rate is kind of, I think, a good measure of what the system sort of does with you once they get you.
And you had mentioned that once before, that the rate of readiness was almost identical to the graduation rate, that there's about a 30% number of students that aren't ready for kindergarten, and there's about a 30% dropout rate.
Right. They may not be exactly the same children, but it's, you know, it's easy. You can do the math, as it were, and you can trace it. And, you know, I mean, I think almost anyone would tell you it is cheaper to teach a 4-year-old how to be more fluent a more fluent reader than it is to try to teach an 18-year-old who doesn't even have that basic high school graduation degree to find his way in life, to get a job, to do, you know, something more than what there is.
Right, and just to let folks know some of the other benchmarks that we're looking at, talked about population, the median age of the population, average income. We talked a little bit about the types of jobs that are out there, how many people are actually working, high school graduation rate, and social mobility rate. I think that's an interesting one too. Once you're born into a zip code, it's almost unlikely you're going to get out of there.
Yes, there have been lots of studies lately, particularly showing that the mobility in the middle class in the United States as a whole is much decreased over what it's been before, and that's a measure that the Haas Center is going to come up with for us, and it'll basically track the likelihood of, if you are born in the lowest economic bracket, what's your chances of rising out of that. And I think that'll be a really telling statistic for us.
Absolutely, and it's just one of many things that we're taking a look at, and that what we really hope that once we get the answers to some of these, that again we can focus the conversation, get everyone focused on the same things, and really work at improving this community, because we do have some great resources. Our kids are certainly our resource.
Absolutely.
We've got the beaches that everybody talks about, but if you're trying to attract a company to come down and set up shop here, they might take a look at our crime rate and our education issues and might not even want to set up shop before we have a chance to tell them about our beautiful white beaches. So this is an opportunity for us all to work together and capitalize on what makes Pensacola great already, and then work together hopefully to improve those things where we do need to grow.
Absolutely, and one of the other fantastic things that we're going to do is not just let our data sit on a shelf, but we are going to try to find communities of similar size and demographic and find case studies for people who did it right, because there are people who have done it right.
Absolutely, thankfully, and we can learn from them.
Yes, absolutely we can. And that is what is exciting to me as a journalist and as a citizen and all that good stuff. I think what the opportunity we have is really important, and the talented team that we have assembled is going to do a really good job.
I'm looking forward to it.
It's going to be fun stuff.
Absolutely. Never can tell what we're going to come up with next.
That's true. Okay. Well, thank you. Stick around, and we'll be right back. There's a lot to like about the progress Pensacola is making. After a long stretch where it seemed like our downtown was dead, recent years prove there is life in Pensacola yet. Those great ships down at the port of Pensacola mean that business is good for Buddy McCormick at Offshore Inland, which translates into good business for the port and the city. And that's good for you and I, fellow taxpayers. The sea of fans who came to a recent Wahoo's game to watch two-time Masters champ Bubba Watson throw out the first pitch is progress. They came to cheer on a local boy who grew up and did good. And they watched a baseball game, grabbed something to eat and drink, spending money in a place that 10 years ago was a weedy lot full of toxic waste. That is progress, brothers and sisters, if ever I saw it. The future home of Bank of Pensacola at Main and Palafox is rising by the day, a welcome sign that investors see what Quint and Rishi Studer are doing at that intersection and what the city did with the trendy alfresco lunch spot, and they're adding their 2 cents. Downtown isn't the only place there's action. Escambia School Superintendent Malcolm Thomas says the next schools he builds will have to be an elementary and middle school near Beulah, thanks to the ever-growing presence of Navy Federal in the central part of the county. The next step, though, is to tap into what was recently described to me as the inkblot theory of growth. That is the way, I am told, Sam Walton grew Walmart, building his store every other or every 2 towns, so that the ink blots they made eventually bled together, covered more territory. The challenge now is to be sure that those pockets of progress spread and touch as many zip codes as possible. That is why the work that the Studer Institute hopes to do is so important, and why the Institute's first publication, its baseline report, will lay out the data behind the economic and social trends that are driving our area's economy, and the things that are holding it back. We can't get any further than we've come unless the next wave of progress includes the reception hall at Brownsville Assembly of God Church on April 22nd, with all 230 chairs full. When Commissioner Luman May called a town hall meeting in his District 3, he did it at the spot where the county and the city jurisdictions bump right up against each other, where one side of that street is inextricably linked with the other. The people who came to that town hall meeting came to ask questions of their mayor, their sheriff, their school superintendent, and their county commissioner, because they care. Because they want their community to be better, to rise above its challenges, to show its children there are options for the future. But they need good tools to help them do it, including objective data that shows things as they are, and case studies that show how other communities with similar challenges face them. They don't have all the answers, and some of them may even feel like the people who do have the answers don't return their calls as quickly as the calls that come from other zip codes. They still had enough faith to show up that night and ask their questions. And they came to get their answers and be counted. Folks who are willing to start what will surely be a long journey, and who seem to be willing to take that journey together. You know, if the sheriff isn't buying that old trope that people are afraid to talk to the police because there are avenues that let you give information anonymously, then I'm not buying the old trope that folks in those neighborhoods don't care what becomes of where they live. I have a church reception hall full of people for my proof. Thank you so much for joining us. Please be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter at @OurProgressNow, and stay tuned. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.